Hello and welcome everyone to the Finding Inclusion webinar. My name is Faizan Imtiaz. I am an assistant professor of organizational psychology here at Towson University. And for our session today, we have a very special guest, Dr. Leah Cox. Welcome, Dr. Cox.
Thank you.
So Dr. Leah Cox is the Vice President of Inclusion and Institutional Equity here at Towson University. She received her doctorate from the University of Maryland, College Park in college student personnel. And before joining us, she spent time at the University of Mary Washington and Gallaudet University in various diversity and inclusion roles. So with that introduction, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how long you've been at TU and how you view your role here.
Oh, well, thank you for that great introduction. I've been here at Towson for 3 years now. It is an exciting role where I get to do education, programming, training, initiatives, all kinds of things for the entire institution, looking at how to make Towson more inclusive, more equitable, and diverse. And so this is an inaugural position here at Towson, and actually the first Vice President of Inclusion and Equity in the state of Maryland. So this is a really exciting time to do all kinds of wonderful things here.
Yeah, exciting indeed, and a lot of new and moving parts. And so actually that kind of eases us into the first topic point that we wanted to chat about, and that is how we view this topic of diversity and inclusion. And as we were kind of looking at your formal role at the university, one of the things that we noticed was diversity is not even in the title. So that's interesting, right? Because I feel like a couple of years ago, you might have been the director of diversity on campus, right? Isn't that interesting?
That is. It was an interesting title, but it also spoke to, we know that diversity covers a lot of individual differences, from values to beliefs to all of those things, but it's not enough on our college campuses. So we have done an amazing job here at Towson at making our student population extremely diverse, right? There's 48% students of color on our campus. But what we also want to do is make sure that everyone has an invitation to being a part of Towson, to feeling engaged, to feeling a sense of belonging, to feeling as if they're valued at being here, and that all of their differences, whether it's visible or invisible differences, whether it's race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, political ideologies, all of those things are valued here at Towson. And so the role was very intentional. The title was very intentional.
Deliberate, right?
It was about being inclusive and also being equitable.
Right.
So it speaks to what I do.
Yeah.
It speaks to what we want to do.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I think you might have mentioned a lot of this in what you just said, but I think the first question that I wanted to ask you was at a more personal level. So I know you just gave us kind of the professional level and how you view this role personally based off of your experiences. What does diversity and inclusion mean to you when you hear it not only across the university, but outside in organizations or just on the television and everywhere else?
Sure. I mean, I think in the past, people just thought of diversity as race, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that is how we all went about it probably 25, 30 years ago. And can we just make our campuses and our workforces diverse racially? But it's more than that. It's more than that to me as a Black woman. We're also looking at gender. We look at religion. We look at ability. And having worked at Gallaudet University for over 10 years, it's not just about what you can do. It's the things that maybe you need more access to. And so looking at all of these folks are looking at now cognitive diversity, how we think, right? It's not just about how we look or what we can see, but all of the things that sometimes we can't see that creates this really rich environment at our universities and colleges. And so we get all of those folks here, but do they feel like they're a part of our institution? That's where we get into the inclusion part that speaks to me. I can go into settings and places, and even now, across the state, outside the state, in the country, and sometimes you don't feel included. You don't feel like they really want you to be there. And it's difficult. And I know it's difficult for our students who feel like sometimes in the classroom or in the community or in organizations or clubs that they're not welcome.
Right. So they're there, they're inside, but they don't feel welcomed. That's very interesting. I think So we were thinking about what to call this kind of webinar series, and we landed on finding inclusion. And I think one of the reasons is because of all the things you were just mentioning. To me, I think diversity is very much a byproduct of globalization. It's a byproduct of people being able to readily move across countries and continents easier than they ever have in the past. And so we have campuses that are very diverse. We have neighborhoods and communities and countries that are very diverse, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're inclusive.
Right.
And so you often hear about diversity, things said such as diversity is about the numbers, and inclusion is about actually making those numbers count.
Right.
Right? So it's not just getting people in the door, it's making them feel like I have a seat at the table and my thoughts and my ideas and everything is actually being considered.
Absolutely.
So, and I know that's one of the big talking points of our Leading Diversity and Inclusion program is that distinction, right, and the language around that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just here at our institution, but our students will leave here at some point, and they're going to face a global workforce of which they have to figure out how not only to be that person in the space, but how to be inclusive of others.
Yeah.
And also, as new professionals, how are they feeling about being a part of that workforce?
Yeah, yeah. And it's so interesting because the categories just keep diverging, right? Like we haven't even talked about things like generational diversity.
Right.
And we know from the research that millennials and seniors are by far the fastest growing demographics in the workforce. But often the rewards and the incentives that have been created aren't catered to them. Right. And they want very different things. So again, it speaks to diversity and inclusion meaning different things to different people.
True.
Very good. So building on that, we know that diversity and inclusion is important for today's leaders. There was a recent survey by PwC, and they found that 77% of CEOs either had or intended to adopt a diversity and inclusion platform in their organization. Perhaps more importantly, 85% of those CEOs found a direct link between having those initiatives and the bottom line. So we're very much talking about a business case for diversity, and it's there and it's relevant, but yet it's still extremely challenging. And so even though we've acknowledged it and leaders at the very top of organizations are acknowledging the importance of this topic, why do you think it's so difficult to actually implement it?
Right. A couple of reasons. I think one, folks, well, one, you talked about the generational differences. And so we have young folks moving into the workforce that their idea of diversity is different than what folks who are a little bit older, or my age, are thinking. It's not the same. It's not just the ideas about race and social justice. It's also about this cognitive diversity that they're thinking about and wanting to implement. It's also a big risk. Right. For employers, how do I make this work? So I'm going to create this diverse workforce, but how am I going to make it inclusive? And that also sometimes speaks to you got to be ready to have the conversation. And a lot of us, a lot of folks are not trained to have those conversations. Right. To create that inclusive environment, to figure out what do your staff need, what does your company need to grow, how are you going to grow, are you willing to take in different viewpoints? Yeah. To make your workforce grow. It's hard, it's challenging, and folks aren't always really ready to take a risk. Right, yeah. I love that point. I love the idea of the risk-taking component of it, because I think when something is novel, when something isn't tried and tested, for example, the vice president role being the first of its kind in the state, not at the university, but in the state, these types of initiatives are inherently risky. And you have to put yourself out there a little bit, and you have to be willing to have these conversations. And it's so interesting because I've done some work in creativity and innovation, and it's very similar, right? Because risk-taking, and I'm sure you've heard of the idea of failing fast, right? Fail fast, fail often. And it's promoted and celebrated and spoken about a lot, but on the ground, the reality is very different. Right? Because if you're in an organization and you're trying to be creative and you take some risks and you fail, you usually don't stick around very often. And people see that, right? And so then it deters them from going in that realm, right? Which I feel like there's a little bit of that here. It's, do I want to put myself out there? Do I want to maybe rock the boat? Do I want to be the one to lead this? Do you find that? And it's probably not as encouraged of folk of color. right? You're not pushed to take a risk because most often we don't get the jobs, we don't get the tenure, we don't stay in the jobs, we don't get the promotions, we're not the CEOs. Our businesses, our small businesses sometimes don't survive, so you're not as willing to take a risk. That's not what you're most often encouraged to do. So now you're asking folk of color to say, I'm going to jump right in there.
Right. Yeah. That's an interesting thought as well. I think just to build off of that, when I think of some of the challenges, I think there's two elements at play, and they're related to risk-taking. One is emotion, right? And so often the conversations, when we talk about race and bias and some of the history that those topics naturally bring, it can be a little bit emotional. I know I teach a graduate course, and one of the topics that we talk about is diversity of thought, freedom of speech, right? And that having an important element. And we were talking this was last term, and the conversation got to burning the flag. Wow. Is that a form of free speech? Should that be allowed? And it was so interesting because these two students were going back and forth, and the dynamics were clearly one feeling on one side of the spectrum while the other was on the other. And you could see the emotions. Right. Like you can feel them in the room. And it's interesting because we were able to navigate and have a really rich discussion. But one of the things those students said is, this was great. I can never envision this in my workplace because those emotions would get out of hand. Right. So I think emotion is a big thing. And then related to that is just this idea of uncertainty, not knowing exactly what's going to happen. When I do some consulting around resilience and making organizations a little bit better able to deal with stressors, one of the things that we always come back to with kind of elite athletes and performers is their willingness to go into uncertainty. Sure. And to push the boundaries and to maybe go in areas where you're not exactly sure how it's going to end up, but you know it's important. And that's how you train, right? Right. That's how elite athletes are trained. Yeah. You got to push. Yeah. You got to keep pushing. Yeah. I know recently there's been a lot of talk around the unfortunate death of Kobe Bryant, the very famous basketball player. And so it's funny because all the old interviews surface about the mindset of these kind of elite performers that only come around once a generation or so. And that's what I often hear coming out of their interviews is uncertainty and the boundaries. And not knowing whether you could do it, but wanting to go out there and being drawn to that. And I really think as leaders in organizations, there's a lot to learn from that when we're dealing with these kind of topics. I don't know what an inclusive university looks like completely. Right. Right? But being willing to go out there might be important. You have to sort of envision that it's not going to be perfect, or at least the process to that inclusive institution is not going to be. There's going to be some bumps. There's going to be some bumps, but it's got to be actionable, operational, and sustainable, and everybody's got to at least feel like they've got a piece of this or willing to buy into it. Yeah. And that takes time, right? Because there are a lot of folks who may have to change their way of thinking in terms of the culture and the systems and processes that they've been used to. Yeah. So related to that, if you had to identify one or a couple, what do you think are the biggest hurdles? What do you think is the biggest challenge or challenges facing our leaders in regards to leading diversity and inclusion? Probably some systemic racist policies that still exist that we may or may not know about, and so change takes some time. And then I think just the beginning of changing cultural values and mores. So it's very difficult, depending on the generational pull and experiences and lived experiences of the folks who are at your institution, it's going to take some time. And so that's probably the biggest challenge is time, because our students only stay here a short period of time. Yeah, right? That's interesting, yeah. I've had chats with students around this topic, and they'll be juniors. And there's an initiative that they want to get off the ground. Right. And the reality is it's such a big initiative that it might take 3, 4, 5 years. Well, who knows where they're going to be in 4 or 5 years? And so I've had conversations where I said, you might not actually get to see this while you're here,
Exactly.
but that doesn't mean it's not worth it. So the temporal element certainly, I think, is a big issue. Do you find that, because what I've found with related issues is there often has to be someone spearheading this kind of initiative, right? Like there has to be a face to all of these initiatives. But it seems to me that actually implementing this with success is not a one-man job by any stretch of the imagination.
No.
So what do you think of that kind of, how do you spearhead and lead and be the face while knowing that you need a team kind of?
Right. I mean, I don't go anywhere without my team.
Yeah.
So, and it's got to be across, where even if it's, you know, your company or your corporation, there's got to be a team effort, because no one person can do all of it,
Mm-hmm.
right? If there's no team behind it, it's like a football team. You
Right.
can't quarterback by yourself,
Yeah.
right? So, or baseball, you can hit it, but if nobody's out there to catch it, then guess what?
Mhm.
You know, so you've got to work with a team. You've got to get folks to buy in. You've got to get someone who's willing to keep pushing,
Right.
who's not going to just throw in the towel at any given moment,
Right.
because there will be some gaps, some hard places, some places that you hit and you bounce back and you come in again.
Right.
But it's got to be a team effort, absolutely.
Yeah. And I feel like it has to be a team effort at different layers, right? Because I think, I know drawing from one of my colleagues does a lot of work on creativity and innovation, and there's models about how there's a champion, so there's a champion who kind of spearheads the initiative, but there's also people who might not be on the front lines and you might not see them all the time, but they're the connectors. They're the ones who are actually on the ground, connecting people to the right individuals or organizations. There's people who can coach and just take care of the emotions.
Mhm.
And so there's all these different layers, and I think that structure is often lacking, right, in organizations, because one person is tasked to do this, and they're often feeling like they're on their own and they don't really know where to start. So I feel like there's a lot of utility, and I know with the program, one of the main things we're focusing on is what's the leadership element of this? How do you not only go back, but then take a framework or a structure that then you can actually apply across the organization?
Yeah, I mean, for me, you know, these chief diversity officers or equity officers have been around for a good number of years, and people were thinking, you can just put that one person in place and then
Right.
it'll be magically changed. It cannot. So it's got to be top down and bottom up, right? 'Cause if you don't have the leadership at the top to really drive forward, then
Right.
to change all of the policies and ways of doing things and making sure the programs and trainings are there, you're not going to enforce change. However, you've got to have, as you said, those folks at the bottom who may be the coaches, the counselors, the advisors, all those folks who can then uplift and
Mhm.
bring an additional message that needs to happen, so that eventually you're going to permeate wherever you are.
Right. So I think you know, we're talking about our university and your role. I think for you, would that be something along the lines of you're working at an administrative level, but you need faculty who are on board. You need those professors who, in the department meetings, are going to say, you know, when things are questioned, that this is the way I see it. And I've been in those meetings and I've had those conversations. Right. You need students.
Mm-hmm.
So you need students at different levels and at different groups who are going to be able to talk to their constituents and their peers,
yeah.
right? And so I think, what does that look like at the organizational level is the next step of this.
Yeah.
Great. So that's we've talked about challenges and the difficulties. What are the benefits here? Why, you know, everyone seems to be interested, everyone wants to know, why should they want to know more and implement this?
Well, we know that the workforce is changing. So what is it, in about 25 years, it's going to be 2 to 1.
Mm-hmm.
So the folks of color out there are going to be a huge part of our workforce. And in order to make our nation thrive, and also the world, we've got to prepare our students for this global workforce. We've got to prepare them to lead in a diverse workforce, so that they're not only just there, but they're also leading.
Right.
And so we know that encouraging and making sure that they're ready to get out there and do this is going to help everyone. We also know that they thrive better in the classroom in a diverse classroom. So the challenge of thought and the different ideas and cultures enriches every student, not just the students of color, but every student in there is going to be enriched by someone bringing something different to the table.
Right.
And that's what we want for our students. That's what we want for ourselves. I mean,
Yeah.
I learn from students. I know you learn from students. And so to have a diverse campus where everyone feels included and the ability to speak up and have those challenging conversations that you talk to means we're going to really produce some amazing students.
Yeah, and that's so interesting because it's no different in the workforce. McKinsey did a study recently, and they looked at basically homogenous teams made up of people from the same gender, culture, background, and teams that were very diverse. So, and what they found was that gender diverse teams outperformed gender homogenous teams by 21%.
Wow.
And the ethnically diverse teams outperformed the baseline by 33%. So I think, to me, when we talk about this in the grad program or in the classroom, that's where I see the ears kind of perk up. And because I think it's a language thing. I think it's a communication thing. Until we're able to make what's called a business case for diversity,
right.
Although I think we would all agree that there's pro-social reasons for diversity as well and inclusion. I mean, those are all valid.
Right.
History tells us that until there's that kind of performance outcome argument to complement that, there isn't much that's going to change.
Right.
Right? It reminds me of President Roosevelt's executive order near the end of the Second World War, where the armed forces were desegregated. And when you talk about, well, why did that happen at that time? There was a pro-social push of, well, people should be able to serve regardless of their background. But there was also a business push in that the armed forces needed more bodies. And it wasn't, you couldn't selectively choose who you were going to have. You needed everyone. Everyone needed to jump on board. Right. And so I think that's just one example of how do you create that in your organization to where people feel like it's not just a nice thing to have, right? It's actually important, and people will perform better. They're going to feel better, and they're going to get more out of their work.
It's true. I think when people see that their corporations are thriving, bringing in money, then it makes sense.
Yeah. So I know we could go on forever, but just for sake of time, and this is the first one, we'll get you back some point for maybe like our 100th episode or something, right? Because this is the first. But if we had, I want to, sticking with kind of your institution and what you do here, if you could make one change in America's higher ed system with regards to this topic, what would it be? I know that's a big question.
That is
but
a huge question.
Yeah, the higher ed system in America is so complicated as it is, but what do you think is the one change that would really have the biggest impact?
I think, so sitting in the role that I sit in now,
right,
to be able to have that voice at the table that pushes for equity for everyone, right? I think that there are a lot of institutions who don't have that voice, who looks at diversity and inclusion at the head of the table, right? Not necessarily the president's table, but at the cabinet or council level,
right,
where you can influence change.
Right.
Right. It's hard to do that if you're 3 layers down. Nobody's listening. And so to be able to have that seat and that lens and that vision, and then have not just that CDO person, but multiple people at the table who are thinking about equity and inclusion at the table. That would be great.
Okay.
I think our institutions would change. We'd have less folks protesting.
Right.
We'd have less institutions, having students leave because they're not feeling as if they belong there.
Yeah.
I think it would change.
Yeah.
Change the landscape.
Yeah. So I think just being deliberate, right, and that systematic approach to actually not only having this but applying it and carrying it out.
Right.
Yeah.
That would be great.
Yeah. No, that would be great. So I think we're about near the end, but I want to thank you so much for taking the time was a lot of fun.
It was great.
Yeah, and we didn't get through certainly all of the things that we wanted to discuss, but hopefully this is a start, and we'll have a part 2 and hopefully many more parts. But thank you again, Dr. Cox, for taking the time to be with us, and we'll hope we get to talk soon.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.